I have to get these forensic coroner guys to come in to see what happened. Then I gotta get detectives, detecting shit. Then I gotta get these forensic guys to stick them back in the fucking bag.
Dana White was 31 years old when he was on the phone with Bob Merowitz in the fall of the year 2000. He made a name for himself in Las Vegas as a personal fitness trainer, teaching group classes and private lessons. He thought the idea of the UFC was ridiculous until he had taken private jiu-jitsu lessons at the Academy J-Sect Jiu-Jitsu gym in Las Vegas with a former UFC fighter by the name John Lewis. Dana White soon started managing some of the J-Sect Jiu-Jitsu gym's fighters like Tito Ortiz and Chuck Liddell. Bob Merowitz was having money problems, and as a result, Bob was not paying the fighters their correct amount of money, so Dana White, being Tito Ortiz and Chuck Liddell's manager, was directing his fighters elsewhere, places like the IFC and Pride, which are also mixed martial arts organizations similar to the UFC. After Dana White had numerous phone calls with Bob Merowitz, he recalls Bob saying in a defeated tone that there was no pay-per-views, no money, and soon there would be no UFC. Dana White wanted to take advantage of the opportunity, so he called someone that he knew who had money, Lorenzo Fertitta and his brother, Frank Fertitta III. These two guys ran their own casinos in Las Vegas, Nevada, called Station Casinos, in which Lorenzo and Frank Fertitta were president and CEO of. They took over the company after their dad, Frank Jr., had resigned. Their casinos were predicted to make $990 million in revenue in the year 2000, and they weren't that far from that goal. Dana White called Lorenzo saying, and I quote, "Dude, I think we might be able to buy this thing, and I think we should." Frank and Lorenzo joined Dana White and John Lewis for a private jiu-jitsu session where Lorenzo Fertitta would become obsessed with learning submission holds and grappling. Lorenzo said he wanted to train every day. He even offered to invest and fund John Lewis' mixed martial arts promotion called the World Fighting Alliance. But his brother Frank lost interest in funding the project, learning that they would have to share ownership of the company with other investors. Lorenzo was a member of the Nevada State Athletic Commission at 28 years old in 1997, and he already knew Bob Merowitz. Bob Merowitz invited a group of Nevada State Athletic Commission members to the 21st UFC event, hoping that if they seen it in person, that it would excite and persuade them to allow and sanction MMA in their state. Lorenzo was disturbed by the violence. He says, and I quote, "When you first see it and you're right there in person and a guy's head is bouncing from an elbow or forearm off the canvas, we were like, wow," end quote. A year and a half later, Lorenzo resigned from his position at the Nevada State Athletic Commission and immediately cold called Merowitz, wanting to buy the UFC. Merowitz sold the UFC to Lorenzo Fertitta for $2 million for full ownership of the company. Lorenzo said it was the easiest deal he had ever made. Merowitz said, and I quote, "Look, it's super easy. You go out, get the production team, sign some fighters, do your deals with pay-per-view, cut the commercial, and go on," end quote. Lorenzo's first move was to appoint Dana White as president of the UFC. Even though Dana had no executive experience, had nearly flunked out of high school, cut class, and spent a lot of his time partying and getting into fights, had dropped out of college just a few weeks after attending. Plus, Dana and Lorenzo weren't exactly friends. They just knew each other because they went to the same private Catholic high school, a school called Bishop Gorman in Las Vegas, Nevada. Dana White was raised by a single mother who was a nurse, and he had an older sister. But Lorenzo knew that Dana was obsessive about work and was driven to succeed at any cost. It says Dana was the type of person Lorenzo thought of as, and I quote, a killer, unquote. Dana left Vegas and moved to Bangor, Maine, graduated high school, then moved to Boston, Massachusetts, and enrolled in college at the University of Massachusetts, then dropped out a few weeks later. After that, he started working as a bar bouncer, a bike courier, a bellhop at the Boston Harbor Hotel. But Dana White says the hardest job he ever performed was being an asphalt layer for EJ Paving Company. He says, and I quote, "That was the job that showed me what real work was," unquote. Dana began an amateur boxing career, which was one of his childhood fantasies, and started training with another amateur boxer named Peter Welch at the McDonough Boxing Training Center in Boston, Massachusetts, in Southie. Peter Welch says, and I quote, "From the first blow he took to the chin, he proved he had the stuff to stick around the game," end quote. Welch and Dana started teaching fitness classes at the gym, where he would ride a bike to the gym every day because he couldn't afford a car. On the ride there, he would often listen to a lot of Tony Robbins, who he was a fan of because of his motivational books. Tony Robbins would say things like anyone could rise above their situations as long as they have the courage to act, to live what they teach and walk their walk. Result-oriented people who produce their life exactly as they desire it, unquote. One day in 1995, a man named Kevin Weeks came into the boxing gym and asked Dana to step outside. Kevin Weeks, being affiliated with the Winter Hill Gang, which was ran by James Whitey Bulgar, the Boston mobster who literally terrorized South Boston from the 1970s to the late 90s, told Dana that if he didn't pay $2,500, then they would have a problem. So after a few fear-filled months of trying to come up with the money, Kevin Weeks made a final threat to Dana, and Dana White was on the first flight back to Las Vegas, Nevada, and had to move in with the parents of an ex-girlfriend at 26 years old. From there, he started working as a fitness instructor, introducing himself at every gym he could find for clients. His group classes could attract as many as 140 people for a 90-minute session, so he was definitely putting in that work. Dana seen Lorenzo at a mutual friend's wedding who they both knew from Bishop Gorman High School. Dana had pitched Lorenzo on taking private training lessons, and Lorenzo accepted and started to like Dana. Lorenzo and Frank hired Dana to build a gym in the basement of their corporate office, leading them to going to concerts, boxing matches, and nightclubs together. Jumping back to the year 2000, Frank and Lorenzo was having dinner with their father and telling him that they wanted to buy the UFC, but their father didn't think it was a good idea because of the prior difficulties that the company had. Lorenzo and Frank told their father that the fighters weren't exactly hooligans. Most of them had college degrees, and most of them competed at an Olympic level, just like Randy Couture. And the fights were actually more complex than you would think, and that the barbaric appearance was the result of bad regulatory standards. After purchasing the UFC later that year in December, the Fertitta brothers flew to Tokyo along with Dana White to the 29th UFC event, where they would watch the show and speak to as many people in the business as they could. A few weeks later, the Fertitta brothers made the news public that they would take over the UFC with a limited liability company named Zuffa, which is an Italian word for fight. The Fertitta brothers were sure that they could upgrade the UFC because of Lorenzo's Nevada State Athletic Commission connections and their overall family's business experience. The author goes on to speak on the WWF because the Fertitta brothers wanted to operate on a similar scale as them, since the WWF made around $337 million annually and performed about 100 live shows a year. Dana and the Fertitta brothers agreed that they felt like Merowitz's version of the UFC felt like a morgue. They thought that the lighting was terrible and too dim. Also, there were no TVs in the arena. So, under the new ownership of Zuffa, the 30th UFC event, they remodeled the arena to their liking and even paid an extra $100,000 for a fireworks show at the start of the event and added laser lights and fog machines. Dana and the Fertitta brothers eventually recruited Burt Watson, who was a big fight promoter. At the first UFC event he assisted in New Jersey on May 4th, 2001, Watson was puzzled because he's seen several fighters on the card go straight to the hotel bar as he manned the fighter check-in desk in the lobby of the Taj Mahal in Atlantic City, New Jersey. He says, and I quote, Burt Watson says, and I quote, "In boxing, they just never did that. I very seldom saw a boxer at a bar fight. At a bar fight week." Unquote. Wait a minute, I got to quote again. Then Burt Watson says, "I'm kind of like, okay, is this going to work?" Unquote. All right. Burt Watson remained uneasy when he saw a bill the Taj Mahal Hotel sent to the UFC's makeshift production office for damages to one of the lobby's bar bathrooms. A group of fighters stayed out late in the hotel's bar and ended up in an argument with the other hotel guests who thought that the UFC was just as fake as pro wrestling. And when they said pro wrestling, I don't think they meant Olympic wrestling. I think they meant like WWF or something. But the fighters chased the man in the bar restroom where he locked himself in a stall. Burt Watson says, and I quote, "He wouldn't open the door, so they went and tore the door off. They tore the stall off the wall to get him. I think the bill was like $6,000 or some crazy number. I was totally shocked." Unquote. For better promotion, the UFC hired Carmen Electra, the ex-singer and model, and Dennis Rodman's ex-wife, on an extravagant marketing campaign to promote the UFC, though she had no connections to a mixed martial arts background, but she did have a mass media appeal. Lorenzo says, and I quote, "We decided that we wanted to rebrand the UFC. We wanted to roll it out in a whole new package. And in order to do that, we picked one of the most exciting, beautiful, lovely, nice ladies to be the cornerstone of that campaign, and that's Carmen Electra." Unquote. 3 weeks after the 32nd UFC event, a conference was held to formally request that mixed martial arts be sanctioned by the Nevada State Athletic Commission in Las Vegas, Nevada. When Merowitz and SEG had ownership of the UFC, they were hiring their own referees and judges. Moving forward, hiring and training judges and referees would be the responsibility of the Athletic Commission in any U.S. state where the UFC put on an event. The fights themselves would be governed by the Mixed Martial Arts Unified Rules of Conduct. The unified rules standardize 9 weight classes ranging from flyweight, which is 125.9 pounds, to super heavyweight, which is 265 pounds and over, and mandated that the arena be no smaller than 18 by 18 feet and no larger than 32 by 32 feet. Fights would be 3 5-minute rounds with 1 minute rest periods in between, and championship fights would be 5 5-minute rounds. Fights would be scored with the 10-point must system borrowed from boxing, which the round fighter earning 10 points and the round loser earning 9 or fewer. Spiking or intentionally slamming a person head first onto the mat would be illegal. Also, soccer kicks, headbutts, and knees to the head of a grounded opponent. Also, downward pointing elbow strikes were also forbidden. Fighters would be allowed to wear shorts, groin protection, covering your penis, a mouth guard, and some type of glove. No event would be allowed with fewer than 25 total rounds scheduled, the rough equivalent of 8 fights. Fighters would be required to submit up to date MRI and MRA test results and a full blunt panel test completed within the last 12 months. Also, a general physical exam no more than 7 days before the scheduled event. And the commission unanimously voted to sanction mixed martial arts. The author goes on to speak on the next UFC event, which happened after 9/11, the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And this event was on September 28th, 2001 in Las Vegas at the Mandalay Bay. The 5 fights on the main card ended in decisions due to the fighters being hesitant. 2 of the 5 fights would later be identified as the least active fights in UFC history, with no knockouts or submissions. Each fight took longer than expected, and the UFC's pay-per-view only had a 3-hour broadcast window. So the broadcast abruptly cut off. So fans who had ordered the pay-per-view would have no idea who won the fight on the main card between Tito Ortiz and a guy named Matyushenko, leaving fans waiting weeks for the release of the VHS tape to see what happened. And Dana White would later describe the event as the worst show they had ever done.